Hit that record button. All right, so again, welcome everyone to our Soteria webinar. My name is Daniela Labate-Cavelli. I am with NIAPers. We are so pleased to be here today with all of you on this very progressive conversation about an evidence-based alternative to acute hospitalization for people experiencing psychiatric crisis. We thought it was important to bring this webinar to you on the heels of the New York Times article on the topic, which I am going to drop the link to in the chat box so that you all have access to that. If you haven't already taken a look at that, I would urge you to do so. So I'm going to do that. And we've got a great conversation going on today. We hope you'll be part of it. We hope that you use the chat box or continue to use the chat box to have conversations with us and to ask questions and share your feedback. NIAPers is also really thrilled to co-sponsor this event today with the College for Behavioral Health Leadership. And we have Holly Salazar with us today, the college's CEO. So I'm going to turn it over to Holly to say a few words about the college before we hand it over to Peter to kick things off.
Thank you, Daniela, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here today. The College for Behavioral Health Leadership is always proud to partner with NIAPers, especially when you have the opportunity to share innovative, evidence-based models supporting the mental health and well-being of individuals and communities. For those of you who don't know us, CBHL is a member-based association serving as a resource for leaders whose work focuses on or intersects with behavioral health. We promote innovative, equity-grounded leadership practices, fostering cross-sector collaborations, and I was really happy to see a few of our equity-grounded leadership fellows here today from one of our programs. We also offer leaders inspiration, tools, knowledge, and professional connections to eliminate inequities and improve health outcomes. And so really excited to learn more about Soteria today. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry that I cannot see you all. This is the age of Zoom, when that becomes impossible. If we would have had 120 or 150 tiny little windows, that would be kind of odd. I'm so glad you're able to join us, though, and also happy to have an amazing panel. I'm a psychiatrist and activist, been active for many years, and I'm a friend of Lauren Mosher. Now, Lauren Mosher, unfortunately, left us about 18 years ago in 2004, but we've had many conversations about creating Soteria houses in many places, and New York City was certainly a dream. And now we may be getting closer to realizing that dream, especially, I have to say, because last year I met a young man from Israel, Pisa Flictenberg, who was the first person I actually met after the COVID lockdown in public, first stranger anyway. And we immediately became friends because we have a lot in common, many things, including the fact that he's a New Yorker and I'm not. I'm sorry. So when Pesach started to tell me about the way they've built Soteria in Israel and how successful they've been, I started to get quite excited that maybe now is the time to look for opportunities in New York. And then the second, I mean, you know, as you probably know, many of you anyway, Soteria has been a mirage in a certain way for many people who want to change things in the mental health system for many years. And there have been a few but important replications, but nothing on the scale that you guys in Israel have done. So I was very heartened, but at the same time, we're also heartened because in New York State, we've actually accomplished something that other states have not so much accomplished, but are sort of catching up, which was to introduce respites into the mental health system, crisis respites that were actually started with the Parachute Project first, which was something some of us worked on. We won't go into details on that now, but the respite houses became a big success, and there's quite a number of them now. And the state recently decided to introduce a new category called intensive respite support, which means longer stay and more intensive staffing. And that's when I thought, and we thought, and the group of us that has met for the past year, started to get very excited together with some agencies, community access and other agencies who've shown real interest, that those regulations could make it possible to actually develop Soteria-like facilities in New York within the, within the system of reimbursement, the way things are run by the state now. And so I'm very excited to be here, and I want to hear from people who've been there with Soteria when it first started in San Diego. But I'm going to hand it over to Elon Cohen, who I guess maybe he's going to introduce himself. I'm just going to say that Elon and I met in the course of working on Pursu. I think Elon worked in one of the first respites at Community Access, and he's an activist, but he'll probably say a little more about himself. I'm so happy that you're here with us and start us through this, this exciting webinar. Go ahead, Elon.
Oh, thanks, Peter. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Like Peter said, my name is Elon Cohen. I worked at the first crisis respite center in New York run by Community Access with the Parachute program starting in 2012, and then also with the Open Dialogue mobile team at the Visiting Nurse Service of New York in 2014. Currently, I'm a PhD student at Adelphi University in Garden City, and I'm talking to you from Queens, New York. So I prepared a brief overview of the panel and also the history of Soteria. So I'm going to read that to you now. So I'm immensely grateful and enthusiastic to introduce this conversation about Soteria, New York. Each person on this panel has a unique story to tell about the legacy of Soteria, its present-day implementation, and the need for humane psychosocial approaches to severe psychic distress. Voice Hendricks was the original clinical director of Soteria San Jose from 1976 through 1978. His career in mental health spans almost half a century and bears witness to the dramatic fluctuations which took place following the policy of deinstitutionalization. He brings firsthand knowledge of the practices of being with, fostering interpersonal connection, and building community with persons in acute psychiatric crisis. Jana Jacobs began her career in mental health working with Voice in the original Soteria program. Inspired by her experience at Soteria, Jana has spent decades fighting for the expansion of non-coercive, peer-supported approaches to care for persons with severe psychic distress. She was Chief of Adult Outpatient and Recovery Services for the County of Santa Cruz, founder of the Second Story Peer Respite, and was a Senior Program Officer at the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health. Dr. Pisa Flictenberg is the former head of the Department of Psychiatry at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and was the director of a closed psychiatric hospital ward for 25 years. Working against the grain of the medical model, Dr. Lichtenberg took the professional risk of introducing humanistic and phenomenological ideas into the hospital system, questioning some of psychiatry's core dogmas. Since then, he became the founder and director of the Soteria Israel program, closely based on the original Soteria model. Despite initial pushback from the psychiatric establishment, Soteria is becoming the new mainstream model for acute psychiatric care in Israel. Daniel Bergner is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and the author of 6 nonfiction books: The Mind in the Moon, Sing for Your Life, What Do Women Want, The Other Side of Desire, In the Land of Magic Soldiers, and God of the Rodeo, as well as a novel, Moments of Favor. His recent work, The Mind in the Moon, beautifully explores the relationship between the mind and the brain and charts a path for rediscovering our humanity through relationships and care in the context of severe psychiatric suffering. Additionally, he wrote a recent article in the New York Times Magazine highlighting the pressing need for psychosocial care for persons with severe psychic distress. Okay, so what is Soteria? At its inception, Soteria was the enterprise of humanitarian psychiatrist Dr. Lauren Mosher, chief of the Center for Studies of Schizophrenia at the NIMH. Disillusioned by the alienation and depersonalization he found in mainstream psychiatry, Mosher spent his career advocating for humane alternatives to coercive and authoritarian forms of psychiatric intervention. He drew inspiration from the philosophy of moral treatment, the therapeutic community movement, existentialism and phenomenology, and key figures in the interpersonal psychoanalytic tradition. With these ideas in mind, Mosher and his colleagues developed an alternative to acute psychiatric hospitalization that operated without force, coercion, restraint, or compulsory drugging. Instead of locked wards, Soteria was designed to provide a warm, home-like environment, staffed 24/7 by compassionate non-professionals. Mosher believed that being with a person in acute psychiatric crisis without doing anything to them would facilitate a path through what is commonly called psychosis. Accordingly, the Soteria staff were trained to develop a non-intrusive, non-controlling, but actively empathic relationship with the person in crisis. Rather than managing objectified symptoms of distress from a position of medical authority, the staff were trained to join the person on their journey through the phases of acute mental breakdown. Although the Soteria staff were not licensed therapists at the time, they were taught to regard psychiatric crisis as an extreme defense against overwhelming, often traumatic emotional experiences. The therapeutic process in a Soteria home therefore involved three key components. And this is in the words of Lauren Mosher. 1, define and acknowledge what happened. 2, learn to bear the heretofore unbearable emotions associated with the event or events. And 3, gain a perspective on the experience over time by fitting it into the continuity of the life of the person's social system. According to Mosher, staff worked gently to build bridges over time between individuals' emotionally disorganized states to the life events that seem to have precipitated their psychological disintegration. The context within the house was one of positive expectations that reorganization and reintegration would occur as a result of these seemingly minimalist interventions. Echoes of some of the great psychotherapists like Donald Winnicott, Wilfred Bion, Harry Stack Sullivan, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, Harold Searles, and others who worked with persons in extreme states of disarray are recognizable in the ideas Mosher implemented in Soteria's design. Relational psychoanalysts and peer specialists will recognize Soteria's emphasis on non-hierarchy and mutuality. Contemporary Lacanians, too, may notice its emphasis on mending the social link and honoring the person's subjective reality. Although the Soteria model contains traces of sophisticated psychotherapeutic praxis, its staff consisted of mainly non-professionals, hired for the strength of their character, warmth, curiosity, and willing to be of service to a person in need. There was no defensive clinging to therapeutic dogmas or cherished theories about the etiology of extreme states. Soteria permitted the fluidity and flexibility needed to attend to each individual's unique circumstances and process of working through breakdown. Moreover, the staff took 24 to 48-hour shifts, allowing them to settle into the person's psychological rhythm while avoiding disruptive separations due to staff turnover. Participants and staff shared the responsibility of running the house to the extent that they were able, thus blurring the distinction between their roles, muting the effects of authority, and encouraging reciprocal relationships. So did the Soteria model work? Evaluating outcomes is tricky when the benchmarks of therapeutic success are reciprocally structured by and constitutive of dominant social norms. Nevertheless, Mosher submitted the Soteria model to a rigorous empirical study, utilizing industry-validated measures such as the Global Psychopathology Scale. Participants in the original study were matched according to demographic, diagnostic, and prognostic criteria. The experimental group joined one of 2 Soteria programs, and the control group experienced treatment as usual in one of the top-tier psychiatric hospitals in the United States. To quote Dr. Peter Stasny, the results were a bombshell in US psychiatry. After 6 weeks of treatment, participants in the Soteria groups, most of whom never took neuroleptic drugs, recovered from their acute breakdown at an equal rate to those who were assigned to the hospital group, in which drug treatment was the primary intervention. At the 2-year follow-up, one of the drug-free Soteria groups showed significantly lower relapse rates and frequency of medication use. The other Soteria group showed a non-statistically significant trend in the same direction. Likewise, all of the drug-free Soteria participants performed well above the group mean along the dimensions of rehospitalization, psychopathology, independent living, and social and occupational functioning. Despite the psychiatric establishment's repression of Soteria's experimental findings, versions of the original Soteria design sprang up across the world in Hungary, Vermont, Alaska, Germany, Switzerland, and Israel, to name only a few. For the most part, continued research and meta-analyses have replicated Mosher's original findings. There is a dire need for Soteria New York. Soteria demonstrated that the mental health sector does not need to react to severe distress with force or the negation of the person's subjectivity. We can slow down the cycles of re-traumatization by listening, being with, and creating space for persons in serious distress. This is a crucial message in a time of rising social instability, violence, and authoritarianism. I'm very excited that we are all joined here to listen to Voice Hendricks, Jana Jacobs, Dr. Pisa Flictenberg, and Daniel Bergner, who will share their reflections on this important topic. Thank you.
You turn it over to Voice, right?
Yep, so now I'll turn it over to Voice and to the rest of the panel.
Okay. I understand I have 10 minutes, which is always frightening to me. I always expect at least 4 hours. So I think probably be best for me to speak about in terms of to understanding some elements of Soteria and to partly separate Soteria from the traditional model would be probably the 6 months into the Soteria process, I had to pick up would be a patient at the emergency room that came up as Soteria client. So I usually spend the 2 hours, I don't need to talk to because it'll break into my 10 minutes, but it's a complex process of getting to know someone before I bring them to Soteria. So as a result, when I walk in the door of Soteria, I know this person a whole lot more than the staff or other people in the house at the time. So it's important to me how to transfer my contact with me to the house itself. So as a result, this client he was suicidal, but not. I think he had one attempt before being hospitalized, but not that serious. When he approached Soteria, the other staff and the residents of Soteria, it was very clear to him he wasn't like the other people at Soteria. He made that very clear. And he was speaking to one of the staff. He thought he was speaking to one of the staff, pointing out another person that he's not like. He was speaking to a resident saying he's not like the staff. So it's complicated when you walk into Soteria. It's difficult to tell who's who. But it was very clear that he didn't want to stay at Soteria, even though he agreed to stay at Soteria. So within about a half hour, 40 minutes, he made the decision that he's going to walk out the door and didn't belong in this house. So it was very clear he was going, and he walked out the door, and I approached him and said that I'm going to go with you. And he looked at me and said, to do whatever you want, I can't control you. And so he walked out, and he started to walk at a normal pace. And it was clear, I usually stayed probably about maybe 100 feet behind him. It was clearly he was hallucinating and was talking to himself and had no clear direction where he was going, but he walked. We walked for a good 40 minutes just around Soteria. Soteria is about 4 or 5 blocks from a major university, San Jose State. So, and as we walked, I became closer and closer behind him. And about 45 minutes or so, I was probably no more than 5 or 6 feet behind him. And it was a pretty warm day. This was would be about 2 o'clock in the day. We walked by a convenience store, and I decided to ask. It was clearly he's directing, he's going where he wants to go, and I'm following. So I sort of asked him, "Do you want a soda?" I'm getting warm. He didn't respond to me, but stopped, just stood there. And so I assumed that meant they wanted a soda. So I walked in the convenience store, bought it, and I came out and asked him what kind of soda. He said Coke. Went back in, came back out, and gave him the soda. And I started to walk because assuming. And at that point, it's very clear. Up to this point, I'm following him. At this point on, he's following me. Nothing that it was clear that I controlled direction. The other part that he had been walking, he had nowhere, he was going actually along a large circle. We were closer to Soteria than we were 10 minutes after going out of the house. He wasn't going anywhere. So I started walking, I continued to walk. And it was about 10 to 15 minutes in that walk where he looks at me, the first eye contact for me. And he says, "You're not really Jimi Hendrix's cousin, are you?" That comes out of nowhere. I have no idea where he got that. And it was kind of a shock to me, the fact that he was talking with eye contact to me in a very normal way. And I'm usually kind of push it off, but I thought it was a good way to make some way of making contact. And it turns out, he said to him, he's my favorite musician. And from that point on, we were talking. Most of the first 10 to 15 minutes, it was about Jimi Hendrix. But after that, it transferred into other things, and we walked for another hour altogether. It got to a point where it's clearly he's following me. He's not, at this point, he's not talking to himself, he's talking to me clear. You don't see the symptoms we associate with someone being mentally ill at all. He's just the normal person. And so as we get probably no more than a quarter mile from the house itself, I suggested that, I'll say, the staff, Yana, which wasn't Yana, wasn't there, but the Yana at the time, I said, "She's cooking spaghetti." And he said, "Oh my God, that's my favorite food." So at that point, we were going back to Soteria. There was no exchange about who does what. It's just part of the process. We got back to Soteria. He was not the same person who walked out the door of Soteria. At this point, he was ready to interact with anybody and become part of the. I talk about this because it clearly separates what would happen if he came up the control group in the study and went through the mental health system itself. First place, he would be in lockup. There's no way he would walk out the door in his state. What the system was calling, he was with a 5150, danger to self or others, or the other, danger to self, the other, or I forget the other part anyway. But he was clearly, when he left the hospital, according to the staff, fit that criteria. So he would never have walked out the front door. And if he did get out the front door, no one staff would have walked with him out the front door. He would have been, the police would have called, or they would have come and dragged him back in. At Soteria. Now, and my issue here is how you avoid institutionalization, the process that the mental health systems tend to do to people. We tend to institutionalize by separating them in locked facilities away from the. At Soteria, the whole point is to never take you out of the social context in which you exist. So that probably is a perfect example of the difference of what happened at Soteria versus a normal inpatient setting. The other thing is that who's in control and who's defining reality at any given point. There's no point where I'm telling him that he's ill, sick, or there's anything wrong with him particularly. I'm accepting who he is in that context. And so the walk is a sort of a journey between the two of us in this context. So he, again, at this point, was able to change his relationship to me and the community. It wasn't me telling him that he's this and that and fixing him in any way. It's him directing his process himself. I'm there being with. That's what the concept being with versus doing to. I could have been very different in that context. And I want to be important. This story is me because it's best to tell my story than others. A lot of other stories that people like to tell, but this was me doing it. And there's nothing special about me in this context, except the fact that I'm there and I stay there and be myself in that context, not being the director of Soteria, not being these other labels that I heard. So my relationship is developing between two individuals. The other part is the thing that I think that's important, that the issue of what we talk about of being free in a system to make decisions. Now he, in the hospital, I was warned that he was suicidal, and therefore that he has no right to kill himself. Now, my general philosophy is that anyone has the right to kill themselves. That's a given deal. The issue that always comes up that I'm going to stop you if you try. People in my context that have relationships with me, I believe in a thing. There's a term called Ubuntu. It's a I think what language in Africa it comes to Zulu, I think the language. It means essentially that I'm me because you are you, and we create our reality. The way I see me is just my interpretation of me. The me is in the context is much larger and more complex than that. So the problem is in this context, how do I bring him into that place where he's a part of us, the we of Soteria? Because Soteria, what is important in Soteria is to create a community that is separate from his family of origin. It's sort of bringing him, because what I found, and this is the way the problem I have with 10 minutes, it's complicated to play my theory of what's really going on in all this. When you deal with first break, you're dealing with a specific group of people. And at the age is pretty much between that 17, 18 to 25 range. And there's a commonality that's just consistent with this group of people. They tend to be part of a family, but there's major conflict in what's going on. And I want to be very clear, I'm not blaming the family at all. This has not to do, there's very Soteria families were the greatest families, and some of the other families, some of them were terrible, but on an average, they were, actually, most of the Soteria family were great people, great.
Voice, I'm gonna jump in, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm gonna promise you, you said so many important things, and especially moving things. And I promise you that we're gonna have an all-day training with you and other people who work on Soteria as soon as we get moving, the show moving in New York. And we're gonna fly you in here and have you share your amazing and important stories. And that story you shared was just you could talk about even just that story for a really long time. I mean, how did you know you were Jimi Hendrix's cousin? Anyway, you know,
I don't know.
yeah. So anyway, so I just want to hand it over to Jana now. And thank you. And there will be questions later, and maybe you can respond to one of them as we go along. Thank you so much. Jana?
Hi, everyone. I'm laughing because, Boyce, you must remember a lot of people asked if you were related to Jimi Hendrix because your last name is Hendrix.
Yes.
It
Your
was a
father.
natural association.
But he got the information, I found out later, from a friend in the inpatient
Oh, okay.
that worked their staff. That was how he got it. Told me that later.
Okay, so it's a little hard to know what our audience is actually wanting at the moment. And I know hopefully we're going to have a chance for some questions and answers before we close up the day. But Boyce and I were both asked to maybe give stories to kind of highlight what it was like at Soteria. And I love the story you just shared, Boyce, because it's so typical of being with people and following and being, to the point where you're actually joining. And so when I first came to Soteria, I was an intern at the university. I was really an art student, and I got sort of pulled out of art and became an art therapist. And and I didn't even know what the word schizophrenia meant. I had no background in mental health. I truly met the criteria of just being a person that was hired. They put me through a battery of personality tests at the Mental Research Institute that were basically to, I guess, find out if you're basically a decent person or not. I don't know. Lots of tests, lots of questions. And so I started working, and I was constantly turning to Boyce or calling him on the phone saying, well, what am I supposed to do? Because there was literally no training. To nowadays, we put people through trauma-informed training and intentional peer support training and all these trainings. And at Soteria, it was just, we want you to just be here and hang out and just be with people. And I used to think it was funny all the time. I'd go home and I'd say, they're paying me just to hang out and be with people. But obviously, in hindsight, I realized that was really and is the point of Soteria, that there's a lot of magic and power in that human connection if you can sit on the couch with people in the evening and talk and just be there. And people would pick who they wanted to relate to. So we always worked in teams. Usually a male and a female would work together. And we would do these 3 days, 2 nights and 3 days. Sometimes we didn't sleep at all. If somebody was up all night, we would stay up all night with them, or we would do shifts so that somebody was present, mostly hanging out talking, because if somebody was awake, they were usually really awake. And I remember we had this one young woman who I believe was a twin, and she came in extremely, in a very extreme state. And my only life experience with extreme states, full disclosure, was I did a lot of hallucinogens back in the 70s. And I thought, okay, being with people in this state was like being a kind of a coach with somebody who's on a trip. And I can do that. I know how to do that. And it's actually kind of fun. So I would just use that headset to be with people when they were up all night, talking a lot, and saying really kind of out there stuff. I would follow and see where we were going with it. So this one young woman was pretty out there, and at one point, she was having a hard time sleeping. So I was doing these practice kind of exercises of relaxation. We all learned that stuff in the 70s, massage and how to take deep breaths and relax. Now we call it mindfulness practice, but back then we would tighten up our body and then relax and tighten and relax. So I did this with her on the bed, hoping she would be able to get to sleep, because we all know everyone needs to sleep and they need to eat. And she crawled into my lap and she was trying to breastfeed. And I'm 22 years old. I've never had a baby at that point. And I was kind of freaked out. So I pulled myself away and said I had to go to the bathroom or made up something. And I went downstairs and I called Boyce. It was, I don't know, 11 o'clock at night. And I said, Boyce, what should I do? She wants to breastfeed. And good old Boyce, he came up with an idea. He said, well, why don't you go buy a bottle, baby bottle? And I was like, God, that's a brilliant idea. So I went to the store and I bought a bottle, 24-hour grocery store, and came back and held her in my arms and I let her suckle on the bottle. And we did that, for part of the evening, and she went to sleep. And I'm just giving that as an example of truly being with somebody and meeting them where they are and what they're needing. And I remember this woman finally slept after days of not sleeping. And then when she woke up from a pretty deep sleep, she was pretty different. I mean, she was going back into herself, not really knowing what had happened. She didn't really have a memory of a lot of the extreme behavior. And so we together as a group started kind of helping her put the pieces back together. And at that point, as Lauren would call it, this is where the person has an opportunity to maybe find out what was happening in their life that started them on this journey, and how to look out for those kinds of triggers as they move forward. These are young people who lots of stuff is happening in your life when you're going off to college and separating. And so I don't remember all the details with her particular story, but I remember how profound it was that she was trying to put together what had happened before she came into our house and how she was getting ready to leave and go back to school and get back on her track, which was going back to school and living with her family. And Voice, you might remember some family work with her particular family. I wasn't involved. As house staff, Voice and I were talking about this earlier this morning, that I don't recall being pulled into any family meetings per se. I assumed that was happening with other people that were involved with Soteria, like maybe Voice or Alma, because we were also associated with the Mental Research Institute. But as a line staff person doing my three-day shift, I wasn't meeting face-to-face with family members, at least not while I was there for 2 or 3 years.
Oh, yes, to be quick. Yeah, I talking to you today, that it's kind of for me because you had that experience where families were always welcome at Soteria, except for the first 2 weeks. The issue has to do with them coming to Soteria and becoming a part of the Soteria community. And once that happened, there was no issue between the family and it could be at the house.
So it never happened for me. So I'm going to move on real quick because I know I'm going to run out of time. How many more minutes do I have? Who's the timekeeper here? Anybody? Okay, I don't know. What I wanted to be able to have an opportunity to, because I saw a few people on the chat asking about people with lived experience.
You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. So one thing I learned at Soteria was when I brought my experience of Soteria into the public sector, when I worked in Santa Cruz County mental health, believing kind of naively that I was going to change the whole system and keep everybody out of the hospital, because that's what I learned at Soteria. I discovered that was not so easy, but I finally got a SAMHSA grant and opened the first peer respite in California. And I felt at the time that the whole movement of people with lived experience, that worked for the peer respite, but I often felt that there was some overlap and that people with lived experience could also, if we opened a Soteria today, could be the staff that we would be hiring. Maybe not exclusively, because as Voice mentioned and as Elon mentioned in his description of the pure Soteria model, the idea was to bring in regular everyday people that reflected our culture. And so if you start managing it to be only people with lived experience, then you're again labeling, which we were not doing and we don't do. So again, bringing in people who want to work there and want to be with other people would be my criteria. But I have clearly learned to value that people with lived experience have a heck of a lot of compassion for others who are going through similar experiences, and patience. And anybody who comes in wearing the therapy hat, I would often ask them to please take the hat off at the door, because it's going to get you into trouble in this model. I don't feel it's that helpful. I feel you really got to pull on your heartstrings and your humanness as your primary way of being with someone if you're going to go through an extreme state with them and come out the other side, because there's no rules and there's no script. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jana and Voice. I'm going to transition now to Dr. Pisa Flictenberg, who has created Soteria Israel, has written a lot about Soteria, and including one great article about his own journey towards from a traditional psychiatric background to Soteria. And yeah, it'd be wonderful to hear from you, Dr. Lichtenberg, what it's like making Soteria a real sort of mainstream possibility for people in acute crisis.
Okay, thank you, Elon. It's I'm very happy to be here and to see everybody. People suddenly call me doctor. What's happening over here? In Soteria, I'm Pesach. Doctor is only when I talk to the regulators and the government people. Otherwise, I'm Pesach. I've been fascinated by what I've been hearing, especially these stories of the original Soteria voice. Every time I hear from you, I learn so much. And Yana, your stories also are wonderful. And I started out as a very conventional psychiatrist. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, but after medical school, I made my way to Jerusalem. I own mild case of Jerusalem syndrome, I suppose. And it was a heady time in the 1980s. We thought that with the advances in genetics and brain sciences, we are going to figure out mental illness. And I was a part of that. I can understand those. Who heard of Soteria? They were so not relevant. I thought I was taught, I understood at the time. And I went ahead with getting into the psychopharmacological research and treatment and so on and so forth. And when I'm critical of this stuff, it's sort of unrequited love, because I thought it would be great, and it was just such a failure, and it was hard after a while not to see that. I was in charge of a locked ward, all that involves, you can imagine. Parenthetically, and if you want to, anyone who wants to read a very intelligent, up-to-date description of the hope that we had and the failure, which even honest neuroscientists and psychiatrists will admit to today, I strongly recommend Daniel Bergner's book, Daniel's with us, the Mind and the Moon. It talks about that deep disappointment. It captures that very well. It was at the beginning of 2005 that I began to think, why do we need an institution? Why can't we do something different? I discovered the Soteria model. It was about that time that I had a patient named Avremi who was diagnosed with catatonia, but won't go into all the details in the little time allotted here. But we understood that, I understood that what he needed was not medication, but a religious ritual. And that's what brought him out of it. So I could have at that point hung up a sign, exorcism performed here, but I decided instead to think what the implications of this are. And it was at that time that I discovered Soteria. And let me tell you, it is a unique form of torture to be working in a closed ward and to suddenly discover and to read the book by Lauren and Boyce, Soteria, and to feel, hey, I want one of those also. It's not fair. And I want my own Soteria. And it only took me about 12 years and endless conversations and talking to everybody, and everybody saying, oh, great idea, sure, but not yet, or we'll get around to it, or the check is in the mail and such things. And it was finally in 2016 that we said to hell with it. Avremi, that patient in 2005, was by then a psychology student and became my most essential partner in actually setting up the first home in 2016. And the first year we were unregulated. We were threatened by a lawyer that we would all be placed in jail if anything bad happens. And thank God nothing that bad happened, just a few bad things. But it was to discover what Soteria is. It was to eat meals together, to have people yelling about the voices that they're hearing, and then to just transform into a conversation about those voices by other people who hear voices. It was a pioneering time. It was getting together staff, mainly companions, the people who work there, and mainly non-professionals, but they're good people, and that's what you need in order to be in Soteria. You have to be a good person, not judgmental, the ability to be able to contain these intense sorts of feelings, and don't have to go too much into that because they've gotten a sense of it from the original Soteria. But from the beginning, I knew that from the beginning, I was asked, if Soteria is so good, why is there a house here, a house there, and why doesn't this happen more? And I didn't really have a good answer. I mean, I understand that some of it is because the sense that Soteria is going against the grain, against the regnant paradigm. I still hear some of my senior colleagues explaining how by saying that mental illness is brain disease, we're reducing stigma. And I used to think that too in the 1980s, 1990s. It seemed reasonable. Of course, it works the opposite. It makes it even more frightening and stigmatic. So is it possible to have more than one Soteria to make it a part of the mainstream? And that was a challenge as we set up the first Soteria. And good fortune is always helpful over here. And the fact that I'm a professor in the university and all those years behind me and all the contacts I made, it wasn't so easy to dismiss me, despite the attempts by many to do that and to think that I'm a Scientologist and other such things, which are not near to the truth. I make clear that I'm not an anti-psychiatrist. I'm a critical psychiatrist, which is a whole different ball game. After 1 year of amazing work, of proof of concept in Israel, I would, at staff meetings, at house meetings with staff and with the residents who were living with us at the time, I would say, we're going to have 1,000 Soterias for 1,000 years. It's never going to be so much fun as this first year with no regulation. But we knew that the goal was to become a part of the system. And though the bureaucracy can be pretty heavy in Israel, I've discovered perhaps not as problematic as it is in New York, I'm amazed to discover. But nevertheless, within 1 year, the ministry, the health ministry came out with official guidelines which made us legitimate. Suddenly we weren't this pirate underground illegal outfit, but we were legitimate. A month later, we had our first inspection. Yes, that is the cost of becoming legitimate. But there are many other costs which we had to make, and any kind of compromises, it was necessary to maintain perspective. The goal is to have as many Soterias as possible. The goal is to be a part of the system, to be funded. In Israel, as in all civilized countries, healthcare is universal and free, right? So we wanted to be a part of that. And that requires that we have this legitimization and inspections by the government. It requires toning down some of the things that we would say once we got this legitimization. It means that we have to, everyone in Soteria, or at least some of the professional staff, has to speak 2 languages. You know, within the home, we're talking about what the experience is or what you're feeling, and being with is such a central principle is discussed over here. But when you write the letter to the insurer, it's oh yes, a diagnosis, that will be yes, F23, definitely, and so on and so forth. Those are ICD numbers, the alternative to DSM, but the same, just as problematic. It also meant that, so there were some questions about peer respite. As opposed to a peer respite home, we do have professional staff. This is part of the government regulations. I shouldn't complain because I wrote most of it, at least the first version, but it made allowances. Every house there has to be a psychiatrist, a social worker, a psychologist, a very part-time nurse. also choose people who understand what we're doing. And of course, the central therapeutic, the central home ingredient of the place are the companions, the non-professional people. I am so jealous when I hear about staff being able to work 3 days, 2 nights. We started with 24-hour shifts. Financially, we couldn't handle it, so it went down to 12-hour shifts, which is long, but it's not that long. And when there was a COVID outbreak and the house had to seal itself up, so for a week, the staff remained in the home. It was like suddenly there was a shift of a week by a number of staff members, the companions, who split between themselves the times they would be on duty, so to speak, but you're never off duty when you're in the same home. And this happened 3 times, and the staff came out of it euphoric. Wow, let's have week-long shifts. I finally get to know the people, and believe me, they knew the people quite well before that. So that is really was very special. Now, we always have to maintain good relations with the regulator. The way it works in Israel, there are 4 large HMOs which cover all citizens. Soteria has already signed with 3 of the 4. Soteria has there are currently 2 Soteria homes. Based on those regulations for Soteria homes, many other people have taken up the challenge, and today they call it balancing homes. Not that great a description. It's sort of another expression used sometimes in the research are START homes, short-term acute residential treatment homes, and these, though not officially Soteria, there is actually a German language Soteria fidelity scale, which we've translated into Hebrew. And most of these homes are pretty close to Soteria, certainly a lot more than the hospital which they've come to replace, whose purpose is to prevent hospitalization. 17 of these homes are currently operating in Israel. And again, 2016, we started our first underground home. In 2017, the regulation came in. I've managed, based on some sort of calculation, to put into the Ministry of Health the concept of 130 homes being the goal in order to satisfy the demand for this service. Soteria historically, I'm so inspired when I hear the stories of the original Soteria. Soteria has varieties, which are different places. You might call the left wing and a right wing. The left wing, everybody wants to remember. The left wing is, there's no professional staff. No way anyone's going to get medication over here. And you don't, and that's the way it goes. And then you have the so-called right-wing Soteria homes, where we'll give diagnoses and we'll give medication. They'll probably need less, but and the staff is mainly professional. I think of the wonderful home I saw in Soteria Bern, in Bern in Switzerland, and they are the longest lasting, the longest existing Soteria from 1984, and they're part of the system. It's only a single home, but they do wonderful work. So we're somewhere in the middle. We have professional staff. We give less medication. There's no talk of diagnosis in the home, but we have this double language, which allows us to exist within the system. These 17 houses, they're certainly less ideological in terms of get them off the medication wherever possible, and let's not talk about diagnosis. But it's still something which following Soteria's start has blossomed, has opened up people's minds and become a real presence in the mental health care system, so that hospitals which were originally psychiatric hospitals and departments who were originally quite inimical to this idea or disparaging, now they're in contact and communication. They send people to Soteria, they get people from Soteria, and they really it's become part of the culture. It's also spawned all kinds of ideas about other services which are now offered in the community without having to hospitalize people. So is Soteria ready for the big time? Is ready for Broadway? Ready for New York City? Well, I would hope so. Yeah, Peter. It was in between COVID waves. I suddenly had a good excuse. The wedding of a nephew who's a psychiatry resident and is listening now, I believe. Akiva, hi. So I'm in New York. This is a chance to spread the good word, and I made contact with Peter, and things. I'm so happy that things are moving forward, and I got to know when to buy the ticket for the opening of the home. I'm waiting to click on order.
The scissors to cut the ribbon. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pisa. It's very inspiring. A lot of people say, oh, if it's not perfect, we shouldn't do it. The system is, but the truth of the matter is the perfect is the enemy of the good. We've done, many people have worked on alternatives to the system for 40 years now, more even. And the system still reigns. And every day, thousands of people go to the emergency room and end up in inpatient units that are so far removed from Soteria. So to have an impact on those people that travel every day into the system, new people, not so new people, I think you have to think big, and you have to find a way to pay for it. There's no other way around. We can be idealists, we can say, but there has to be also a boundary where we don't compromise anymore. So I am very excited that Daniel is here with us today, Daniel Bergner. In fact, that day when I met you, I also met Daniel for a moment, which was very nice. And the fact that you managed to get that beautiful, beautiful article into the Times, and your book, which I unfortunately haven't read yet. I will read hopefully soon. You also have a very personal connection to this story. So give you an opportunity to react and then open it up to some of the questions from the chat.
Thanks, Peter. And of course, thanks, Pesach, eternally. For this book, The Mind and the Moon, I've had great teachers. That includes psychiatrists, neuroscientists who are in conventional research and conventional practice, who led me deep inside the brain, but also taught me about our psychiatry's frustrations in getting as deep inside ourselves, our psyches, as we once believed we could. And as neuroscientist after neuroscientist told me, having really not made any true progress in terms of medicating our way to mental health in about half a century. I also had some really great teachers in terms of their personal journeys, and that starts with my brother, who, when we were in our early 20s, back in the early 80s, as you know, when the medical model was just taking full hold, he was diagnosed as severely manic depressive with psychotic elements, and his journey has taught me again and again and more deeply now for all the decades since. And then I'll just mention one other magical person who some of you know, Caroline Mazel-Carlton, who is a leader in spreading the Hearing Voices Network and is just absolutely marvelous mind who I've learned so much from. But then there's Pesach. So I was lucky enough to make my way to Israel, and Pesach taught me in all kinds of ways, mostly by inviting me into his Soteria houses. But there's one important way that I need to mention, and that is through a rabbinic parable. and it is the parable of the turkey prince. And so I am going to read to you just a few paragraphs of that parable in brief. This comes about 2/3 of the way into my book when I'm beginning to turn a corner and to look at new ways, innovative ways to address what conventional psychiatry has not quite successfully addressed. Once there was a prince who went crazy. He believed he was a turkey. He took off all his clothes and crawled under a table and refused to eat anything except to peck at bones and bits of bread which were left for him on the floor. The king and queen were distraught. They called for the royal physicians, but one after another failed to carry out a cure. The prince remained a turkey, naked and pecking. Then a sage arrived to offer his services. He undressed and sat beneath the table, nibbling. "Who are you?" asked the prince. "What are you doing here?" "And you?" asked the sage. "What are you doing here?" "I am a turkey," said the prince. "I, too, am a turkey," said the sage. They spent time together like this, getting to know each other, until one day the sage asked the king's servants to bring him some shirts. "Is there any reason why a turkey cannot wear a shirt?" the sage asked the prince. Each put on a garment. The sage signaled the servants for pairs of pants and asked, "Is there any reason a turkey cannot wear pants?" The same transpired with socks and shoes, and soon they were both completely dressed. Next, the sage requested regular food, and when this was brought, asked of the prince, "Is there any reason why a turkey cannot eat good food? I think one can eat what one wants and still be a turkey." They feasted together, and sometime later the sage inquired, "Is there any reason why a turkey must sit under the table? Surely a turkey may sit at the table with his place nicely set." And in this way, the prince was fully cured. What does cure mean? Who are we really? And above all, in addition to those meanings that the parable imparts, or those questions it asks, above all, it just says, get under the table, be with. So, Pesach, thank you for teaching me this rabbinic wisdom. Thank you for teaching me about Soteria. And I'm going to stop there because I'm not the expert here. I've learned from you, Pesach, and from others such as yourselves. I'll turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Daniel. I just want to make one point that I was familiar with that parable for many decades, but it was actually Avremi who realized its relevance to the work what we do in Soteria as a way of explaining being with in a story version.
And I would say, though you mentioned Avremi, for the rest of you, Avremi's story, which involves going to the Western Wall and believing that the Messiah would come and that Avremi himself would greet the Messiah and clothe the Messiah and welcome a new age to the world. And then Pesach's ability to meet Avremi where he was is really, really a magical one and is an emblem of all you stand for. And then Avremi's involvement in Soteria, also magical and an emblem of just a very expansive understanding of the self and soul.
Well, I'm going to thank everybody so far for their contributions. I wish we could be in an auditorium and see all of you and call on you to ask questions. but the way the system is forcing us to be now, it sometimes has some advantages because we have more, actually more simultaneous exchanges going on with this system than we could have had in an auditorium. But Laila Caron has been with this project, which has for a year and helping coordinate it. And I want to turn it over to Laila to field some questions from the chats and see who wants to answer them.
Thank you, Peter. And if anyone has additional questions, please put them in the chat and hopefully we'll get to as many as possible. So this question came during Pesach's talk. Consciousness that manufactures stigma can't be used to fight it. Asking questions threatens guilt. Why desire to become part of a system? It will colonize. Guidelines expect a hospitality for a large number of residents. Yes, growth production are the seeds for reducing freedom. The companions are bound and not reimbursed as the clinicians.
Shall I comment on that? I think that this question highlights a real danger of what we're doing, of being co-opted by the system, of eventually fading and just becoming a sort of an open ward in the community instead of offering the special things that we offer. Yes, this is a danger. The other danger is of not becoming part of the system is that we would serve wealthy people who can afford to pay what's necessary in order for the house to continue to function. So we'd have one home, sort of a boutique home, maybe two, and the wealthy would be able to send their loved ones there for some of the care they couldn't get in their home. It seemed to me that was a choice which we had to make. Become a part of the system, a system which will make this available for everyone, or remain something very exclusive. It's sad how the life expectancy of Soteria homes should be much longer than it has been. So the Bern, Switzerland home is soon will be 40, but that is such an exception. I'm trying to I tried to make Soteria into something which would be sustainable, and yes, that has involved compromises. I still think that the experience for the person coming there in a time of crisis is so different from what he would get were we not an option. Would he have had to go into the hospital instead?
I just jump in real quick. I mean, the people talked about professional versus non-professional. I think the fact that this and salaries, of course, are an issue, but everybody is in the current way we're dealing with. Everybody's a professional, including peer specialist professionals. So that's how we look at it. And once people have been trained and so forth. But in any case, is there another question?
Yes. So there was a question earlier about estimated cost per person and number of beds, and another question came in asking, is there any funding, budget, financial models, and templates available for people interested in starting their own Soteria home in their community?
Obviously, we have that in Israel, but the financial reality is so different in the States. You can send a template, but you'd have to fill in the numbers.
We are trying to figure that out in New York, and I'm sure, the whole dilemma of whether the system should pay for this versus not is a big dilemma. But the fact of the matter is the system right now pays for a lot of terrible stuff. And so to get more into and there is some beginning of success. Of course, psychiatry will respond at a certain point when they're feeling like, how many people are they literally able to take away from us? Are they really going to take first people in the first episode, which we want in psychiatry so we can teach our residents? So all that could happen. Anyway, I want to make sure that all the other panelists have a chance to respond to questions. So hopefully there's also going to be something for them. Lila.
I wanted to respond a second to the
Okay, go for it.
financial question, because I think every state, every town has slightly different costs because how much you pay your staff and how much housing is varies from place to place. It's more expensive in New York than it's going to be in Ohio, for example. But like our peer respite, staff 24/7 costs about anywhere between $600,000 and $700,000 a year and that's with people not having the same model that PASOK uses in Israel. So as you add staff, you add, those wages to your costs. So I'd say the bare minimum is going to be about $500,000 to $600,000 in the US. And then if you're going to add a part-time psychiatrist and a part-time therapist and a part-time nurse, those costs are going to get built in. Ideally, you do want, as Peter was saying, the system is paying for some pretty lousy services that just are keeping people sick. So pulling some of those dollars out and having them fund something that's truly a model that's helping people on their path to staying out of the system. I mean, there's a case to be made, but if that helps, that's the answer in general, somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000 a year, kind of minimum.
I'm not sure how helpful this part, but Soteria, that was a part of the study itself, the costs. And essentially we were compared to probably a very expensive mental health system. Santa Clara County is one of the highest paying staff of people in the county, employees. And they came out to pennies difference between the two models.
But much wealthier because the people who succeeded at Soteria didn't cost the system anything for the rest of their life.
That's right. That's a good point.
Chronic people that
yeah.
are created in the mainstream.
So it's the cost of going to treatment is a misnomer. The long-term cost would be drastically different.
Someone asked, what rules would you have to accept in order to receive funding, and how would integrity be preserved through the system?
Who are you asking?
So I think this question could go to all of the panelists.
Not totally understanding the question. What rules would you have to accept to maintain the integrity of the program?
It sounds like the question is about how would one approach maintaining the integrity of Soteria while working within the system, is how I understood it.
Well, I can say something about that. I mean, first of all, this fidelity scale that Pesach mentioned, and also Lauren and Voice and came up with a fidelity kind of list of fidelity criteria. I think those have to be applied. Then there's this other issue which happens all the time. Like you have a place like a crisis respite that functions or a peer-run respite that functions in a certain way. And if they get money from the state, which many of them do, they have to satisfy some bureaucratic expectations. So sometimes it becomes like a system of double bookkeeping, not really double bookkeeping, but sustaining something that's one thing and then providing information to the state that justifies that thing within the system that's paying for it. I don't think it has to be a contradiction because you're not lying. You're just using a different language. And that's a tricky thing, but I think it happens all the time.
What I find is that the greatest challenge to maintaining Soteria is often financial, and being able to have enough companions there to be able to have long shifts, which are much more expensive because of labor laws. So you pay a lot more for the 15th and 20th hour than you do for the first 8. I find those have been much more limiting than the others. No one has ever made a regulation you must give medication. It's true that sometimes the insurers, the HMOs, will say, "What? We paid for 2 weeks and he hasn't gotten any medication?" But that can be handled. That's okay. So really, it's I found that maintaining, being true to Soteria has been often more challenging financially than bureaucratically.
So, I mean, part of the reason why we're having this webinar is because we're actually quite optimistic about starting something in New York. I don't know if I want to make an official announcement, but there's at least one agency, maybe more than one agency, who is about to transform one of their current houses into a Soteria-like model. So I think this could really actually happen. And when it gets to that point, you know, I don't want to knock all the efforts that people are doing, like in Oregon, and people are talking internationally about Soteria houses, but we've been doing that for 40 years here and there. And I think it's worth jumping into an opportunity. And I am hoping that the state would help us do this rather than oppose it. And then I think it could be a really safe and totally helpful model for a lot of people.
Thank you. So I think this question could go to all the panelists. Are there limits on lengths of stay? How are people supported in their transition when they move on?
I can talk about our experience. On the one hand, and this is very good to demonstrate the issues involved here. On the one hand, the insurers put a limit on how long we can have keep people in. In the original Soteria, voice correct me if I'm wrong, the regular stay was several months to half a year, and sometimes people would stay longer than that. I wish that were possible. There is no way to be able to get public funding if you're going to keep people that long today in the reality of 2022. So again, you know, I can stay a private home without public funding and keep it as long as I want. I would get to a lot less people, and it would be, that would also present a problem. So yes, sometimes they say they can only stay for, one HMO says 6 weeks, it doesn't matter what. Another one, you have to convince them every 2 weeks, but in the end it could be 2 or 3 months, but not longer than that. The average stay in our homes is about 35 days, which is long, much longer than what you have in the United States hospitals, a little longer than what you have in Israeli hospitals. But interestingly, in our research, we saw that the private pay people who we had without the HMOs would stay less time because they couldn't afford to continue to pay. And so actually, despite the time limit, people were able to stay longer by getting public funding. Yeah, these are the sorts of dilemmas which we work with. You'll never have everything that you want, and if you try too hard, it's going to ruin everything.
I like to be sort of be clear here, because I keep hearing about Soteria being 6 months. The reality is, and this is in the study, so it's very clear, the first year, probably you could say the average stay was 5 months, but it had nothing to do with people being able to function on their own community. But this overall time period was the 3-month average. What you found in that first year and a half, that the staff, we had no idea how to get rid of anyone, how to discharge them. It had nothing to do with the clinical part itself. We took the first resident, it took us, well, actually it really was more 6 months to get her out. She could have, if she was at the end of the stay, she would have probably been there a month and a half. But that other part, it was like, it was her home, and the way we actually got her out was I think we rented 3 apartments at least that they had to give up. The fourth apartment we rented her, we decided to have a party. So everybody and the person went to this apartment and we had a party, and it was the most fun thing we were doing. We had, it was exciting. It went on till about 1 o'clock at night. Then people went home, and the senior staff, the person who had been there, female, the longest, spent the night with her at that party. So the first person we actually got out was that party to get her out. But the first 2 weeks, she ate at Soteria. It took 2 weeks more for physically to live in the house and cook her own food. So it was a process. Within a year, we were able to sort of draw that 6 months down to 3 months. There was a large percentage of people who would be there less than a month. So on average, it was 3 months. But I remember one resident, I think, who really used Soteria and actually was only there for 3 weeks. But he became a really integral part of Soteria, and he wound up being one of the significant volunteers who hung out, and a few times got paid for filling in for other staff who didn't make it. So it's complicated. It's not a very simple thing, and it wasn't. The length of stay has more to do with the staff skill of getting someone to leave.
But I would also say what I really loved about the community there was that people were welcome to come back whenever they wanted. It wasn't a locked facility. So one of the ways people would leave is to know they saw other people would come over for dinner and hang out, and they knew them because they had just left Soteria and they went to an apartment in the community. And they, as Royce said, this young woman came for 2 weeks after until she finally started eating at her own place. But there's always been an open door that you can come back. And so you didn't make this abrupt, you're discharged. You were always part of the community and you could come back. I had people that would come over and visit me in my home on my days off and hang out and have coffee with me on the front porch. I mean, that's a community where you're connected.
We
So
talk about Soteria as the house itself, but Soteria was more of a large community. So there's much interaction with people never coming through the house at all. That most of the action was out in the community itself. The person I think you were talking about that came for 2 weeks, she came one night and was there for 5, 6, 7 hours. And also she tells her mother died. And suddenly she spent the night. And then she started going to work and spending the night at Soteria for 2 weeks. And then she went back home and it was over. These people don't get admitted. They're just, there's a bed there. And so they're part of the community. So it's like I say, when you say Soteria, it's not concrete, it's complex. And there's no one that can define it, not even me, what that is. The thing for me is that you're creating a community. You're not going through a hospital to get identified somehow. You're creating a social context and to live. And however you're going through a crisis or however you define that, hallucinate is just who you are in that context. And if most people come into it because if we call resident, came in there because the system said they were a danger to themselves and others are gravely disabled. That's how they got in there. Once they become a part of the system, they're just like everybody else. And when they meet outside of the house, there wasn't a patient or staff. There was just two people who were connected to Soteria, and that was important. The other thing that's important to understand, how I always get questioned, is that really real? Did these people really know each other out of the house? When we closed Soteria, I did an experiment. I found 3 staff, 3 residents, and told them to find, because we were going to I decided to have a party after to find the people who went through Soteria. They found 80%. 80% of the people that they knew where they were, who they were, and all that. So it's real. They were connected. People went through. We're talking about almost 200 people.
Elon, do you want to close us out? Or Lila, anybody wants to close us out? Go ahead, Elon.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say a few words that, it was really a pleasure and an honor to listen to everyone share their stories about Soteria. Voice and Yana, the stories that you shared about the ways that you would meet the person where they were, and in such creative and unconventional ways, gave me so much hope and inspiration. And Pesach, thank you so much for explaining the details of how you are in the process of making Soteria mainstream, and also the parable from Daniel Bergner. That was really remarkable and one that I will keep in mind. And I guess I'm just really delighted. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, NIAPers and the college, and thank all of you. And Lila, I would be to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elon. I think that's all for today, and hopefully we'll have everyone who attended today on our mailing list, so we can send out. I see there were some questions about receiving the video and transcript, and also some interest in being informed of future trainings. So look forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much to all of you. NIAPers and the College for Behavioral Health Leadership will both be posting the slide deck that we didn't get to see, but that has really good information on it, along with today's recording on our website. So that'll be accessible to everyone that attended today and those that registered and couldn't attend today. So we're very happy to do that for all of you. And I don't know about you guys, but I am hoping to see a Soteria house in New York sometime very soon. So I'm going to keep my eyes and ears open for that. Holly, any last words before we jump off? Oh, for some reason we can't hear you, Holly.
You're muted.
Apologies for that.
There you go.
I double muted myself. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. It was wonderful to be a part of the conversation. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.